The DLA Piper survey of technology leaders indicated that 65% of companies use open source software in their products. I don't find that surprising. It's certainly consistent with what I've seen in the marketplace as well as what has been reported by Gartner and by IDC. What I think is interesting is that that is not matched by an open source policy to control the use of that software. Unfortunately, many people believe that open source software comes without strings attached, with basically no obligations. That's just simply wrong. It's like any other software is provided under a license. And some of those licenses can be quite unusual. If you have a commercial company with a proprietary business model, you need to be very careful about the manner in which you use open source software, because one of the most popular licenses in open source software is the general public license. The general public license requires not only the software which is licensed under it, but all modifications of that software to be distributed under the general public license, which requires that source code be provided and that the source code be made available for free and modifications and redistribution for free be permitted. Obviously, for a company with a proprietary business model, that would be a disaster. The DLA Piper survey of technology leaders indicated that 65% of companies with more than 5,000 employees do not have an open source use policy. I find that surprising because there's been many examples that have been publicly discussed about the traps that can happen when you're using open source software. One global Fortune 100 technology company acquired a third party, only discovered that the third party had used general public license code in their product. And at one point, it looked like this $500 million acquisition was going to end up being worth about $100,000 because they thought they might have to make all of the software for this product available under the GPL, which means that you need to make the source code available and you need to let anyone reproduce it and modify it. Happily, they were able to dodge that bullet. But I know that they now have a separate due diligence process for all of their acquisitions, which deals only with open source. So it's important from the point of view of a company to have an open source policy to avoid that type of problem. It's also becoming critical in M&A transactions and financing transactions. So we now have separate representations in M&A agreements and in financing agreements regarding the use of open source software. Once again, it's not a question of whether or not to use open source software. Open source software is ubiquitous, it's inexpensive, it's critical in the cost infrastructure for most companies. But you need to use it sensibly. You need to understand what your obligations are, and you need to make sure that you comply with those obligations. And the only real way to do that is through an open source use policy.